Welcome to Coffee with the Sarlos. We are your hosts of the show, Karen and Kelly Sarlo. Whether you're struggling with grief or you just need answers, we connect you with spirit to find relief, clarity, and direction in life. We can help you move forward. So this is going to be a note for the listeners. We have recorded the episode, which we will air in just a few seconds, but I wanted to offer a disclaimer about domestic abuse. So if you are listening today, you choose to proceed and listen to the episode, it may trigger some feelings if you've experienced it or been touched by it. So please listen with care.
Hi, Kelly.
Good morning.
Good morning. I have a story today about two people, made up names, of course. The female is Abigail. No, not Abigail. Pardon me. Abigore. And the male's name is Lister. Abigore is passed over. Lister is the client. And at the beginning of the session, after consent, Lister says to me, do you think that you could just get somebody if I just gave you their first name and I don't tell you anything else about them? And I said, oh, Lister, that is exactly what I need for you to do. So Abigore comes in and she says to me, I want to talk about me, just like you said in the part about wanting to give him information about the person who's crossed over and then about him. She says, and I want to do it separately. She says, I want to talk about what I went through in life to give you validations to give to him. But it's a little bit not just like I had siblings or this or that. I want to talk about my life. And I said, that's absolutely fine, Abigore. You can offer me anything for him. And she says, I got married and I knew him before I got married. And then I knew him when he was at my wedding and he knew me for a period of time after my marriage. Okay. So I asked him this and he goes, yep, that's true. And she says, this is important. She says, he knew my family. He knew my upbringing and he knew why I picked the type of person that I picked when I didn't understand the type of person I picked. And she said, and my parents were very controlling and not kind people. And she said, I struggled a lot all the way through childhood, teenage years, young adult years, standing up to my parents for anything. And I said, okay. I said, so did you pick a person who would just take you away from it all? Or did you pick a person who would people please your parents with you or stand up to your parents? What was the thing you did? Oh, she says, I absolutely picked a man who was going to stand up to my parents and who was going to help me get my voice out there and my needs met. And I said, okay. I said, that sounds like a wonderful person. And she goes, no, he wasn't. She goes, but I didn't see that at the beginning. I didn't truly see the way that he was going about doing it. I was just happy with the consequences. I was just happy that I was finally getting my way. I didn't pay attention to how he spoke to my parents. I didn't think for a minute that the way he spoke to my parents was going to be the same way he would turn around and speak to me. She said, I was just so damn relieved that I finally had help, that I finally was getting some of my needs met, that I was finally able to say something. And my parents had to comply in some way because he would make sure that they said or they gave me what I wanted. And she says, but I didn't understand that very same kind of language, tactics, tone of voice, consequences of what he did would be something that I would be on the other end of, like my mother and father. I was just so glad for what I was finally getting in it. And she says, in all honesty, at the very beginning, she says, I laughed at the things that he was saying and doing. And I just thought some of it was funny. And she says, years later, I can look back on it and go, that's not funny when you're that person. And she says, but by the time that played out, I was married to him. So I said all of this to Lister, and he looks at me and he goes, That's correct. And I said, okay, Abigore, what else do you want to say? She says, well, he was there. He was at some of those family events, some of those conversations with my parents because he was such a good friend of the families. He was there all the time. And he would say little things to me, Lister would, like, that's not very polite. He would say little things and challenge her partner, and she would get mad at Lister and say something to him to defend her partner. And Lister would turn to her and say back, that's still not nice. You can still say it in a different way. But she didn't want to see that. And so she says, can you please say that to him? When I say all of that to Lister, he says to me, I struggled with all of this. He says, and I can't even begin to tell you right now, listening to Abigore, how much this means to me. This is worth everything. He says, because I tried so many times and I walked away for short periods. I walked away for longer periods, but I always came back to the family. I always came back to her. He said, I felt like she was my sister, though in relationship, she was my friend. And he said, but I felt responsible for her. I felt and I said, did you love her in the sense that you were in love with her? And he goes, no, I was never in love with her. And he said, but I saw her as my responsibility, like somebody that I really cared about. And he said, so I tried so hard to say little things to her, or sometimes I would just walk away, but I would let her know I was disappointed or I was angry. And he said, but I never directed it at her partner. He said, I always tried to keep it that it was our relationship and that I was talking to her, not to her partner. And he said, because I honestly felt that if I started addressing her partner, that I was going to, that things were going to explode. And that if I did that, then he was going to turn all of that behavior that he was giving to her parents onto me. So he said, it took me years to understand that I was avoidant. He says, I didn't understand that because I thought, no, I'm not. I'm saying something right to Abigore. So he says, when I went to therapy, Karen, he says, I had such a hard time agreeing with the therapist that I had avoidant issues because I really thought, no, I didn't. I was saying things to her. I was addressing it to the person I thought needed it to be addressed to because I wasn't looking to have a relationship with her husband long term. I was trying to keep my relationship with Abigore. And Abigore says, could you please tell him I know that now? And I said, yes. So I said to Lister, she wants you to know that she knows that. And he just looked at me and he went, oh. He says, this is so healing for me. He said, this is so different than a therapist telling me that she must know now on the other side or that she's in he says, I went to her service, that she's in a better place. And he goes, but I sat there and I listened to that. And he goes, I just sat there and thought, what the hell does that mean? She's in a better place. What does that mean? He says, why do they throw out the cliche and then not explain what the hell does that mean? And I said, okay, wait, let me ask Abigore. And Abigore says to me, I want him to know that when I crossed over, I fully understood everything. And she says, because when you cross over, it is like being in therapy, but without your own ego, without your own defense mechanisms, without, just all of the shit of how you want to see things, without your own patterns. And he goes, oh. He says, oh, I think I'm getting this without her patterns. And he says, so you literally, you just don't have your own patterns? And you can see, he's trying to figure out, well, what would that be like? If you didn't have your own patterns, would you actually be able to see your own shit? And if you could see your own shit, then would you start understanding that other people loved you? Would you start understanding what other people intended when they were trying to do things? And I said, yes, Lister. Yes, they started understanding that. And he just looks at me and he goes, oh my God, this is what I needed. He said, I needed this conversation. He said, I needed to understand that Abigore passed over understands what all of my intentions were in all of those attempts. He said, that's my frustration. That's where I'm stuck. He goes, my therapist kept telling me I was stuck, and she just couldn't seem to break it down into where I was stuck, because she would keep saying to me, but Abigore's dead. She's got peace. And I would look at her and go, what the hell does that mean? And he says, you're explaining to me what it now means, because I needed to understand what her processes would be. So peace means that you go through healthier processes without the things that stop us on earth or get us stuck.
Okay.
Do you want to rephrase that, Kelly?
Yeah, I think peace or better place simply means that at that point we all come to a mutual understanding, which is the fundamental drive in humans. We all want to be understood, right? And that validates everything else. It makes us feel seen. It makes us feel heard. It makes us feel valued. So you cross over. Yes, healthy processes are in place to help both parties come to a mutual understanding.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then Abigore shows me a piece of paper. And I said, oh, Lister, I said, I see a piece of paper. I said, and he goes, like, do you mean a Post-it? Like, what do you mean? And I said, oh, I don't know. It just looks like a plain white piece of lined paper. And he goes, okay. Could you go and look at the paper? Do you see the paper? Can you read the paper? What do you do with the paper? And I said, sometimes I can read it. Sometimes I can't. And he goes, could you try? Or if you can't read it, can you talk to Abigore about it? He said, just any kind of context around it. And I said, yeah. So I said, Abigore, what are you doing with the paper? And am I supposed to be reading it? Is this about, like, what's it about? And she goes, oh, I want you to see what's on the paper, and I want you to describe to him what's on the paper, and I want to talk about it. Okay. So I start reading what's on it, and I see it's typed. So I said to Lister, this is typed. And he goes, okay. And I said, and it's not signed. I don't see anybody's name on it. And he goes, yeah. And I said, and at the top, there isn't even a name. It doesn't say Abigore or Dearest Abigore. It's not like a letter format. And he goes, well, what is it? And I said, it's just a list. And I said, but it's not bullet points, but it's just a list. And at the beginning of each line, it's just a capital. And he goes, yep, that's correct. And I said, Abigore, what is the significance of that? And she goes, oh, it's a list so that if someone found it, i.e. my husband, he couldn't tie it to me that it's mine because my name's not on it. And there's nobody who signed it, so he can't he can't hold anybody accountable that this is what they wrote or this is to who it's written for. And I said, oh, it's protection. It's to protect you. And she goes, yes. And I said, oh, give me a minute. I said, let me ask Lister this. So I explain it to Lister exactly how this is made. And he goes, it took me a long time to write that list that way. He says, I had to rewrite that so many times. He said, I did not realize that if I had written it and put her name on the top, because I did it first, I signed my name at the bottom. He said it was more of a letter. He said it was more of like saying you and your husband and his name. And he said, and then I spoke to some friends that worked in social work, and they said, don't you dare give her a letter like that, because if her partner finds it, he could beat her. And he rewrote the list. So he got coached by some friends as to what kind of things to put down in the list and how to write it, what to have in it and what not to have to keep her safe. And I said, so this list was rewritten because she's showing that it was redone. And he goes, that's correct. He said, I wrote that list several times before I actually gave it to her.
What was the intention of it?
Well, this is what's important. So then I said to Lister, what's in the list? Like, can I read the bullet points? So I start to read. I read a couple of them. And then he explains more. He said, I was giving her options as to how to get out of her marriage. Because what I could see was that Abigore, to me, it looked like she was never even trying to get out. And I would say things to her in conversation about, you can leave, you can this. And she would get angry or just disappear on me, or she just wouldn't answer the phone. She would just disappear. And then I would run into her, or she would reach out, but it might be months later, half a year later. And he said, or even 2 years later, and all of a sudden she'd be back in my life again. And I thought, he says, I went through so many times of hating her, loving her, caring for her, worrying about her. He said, I was all over the map. He said, and I was trying to figure out, is she bipolar? Is she this? Is she this? He said, I was trying to figure out if she had mental health issues, like how to explain all of these behaviors. And then he said, finally, one day, he said, someone explained to me that her partner probably beat her. And he sat down and went, oh my God, that would explain all of the behaviors of the disappearances, so that if she had bruises or whatever, he said she was hiding things. And he said, it didn't dawn on me that this man's anger and control had gone this far. I had never seen it. And she had never said it. So he said, I started to kind of think, okay, if that's right, then how do I continue to help her? So with the help of some of his friends, he came up with a page of options than being in this relationship. And he did it in such a way that he asked some of his friends that coached women how to do stuff like this. And he put it in paper, and one day he handed it to her. And he had it all folded up, and he just gave it to her. And she asked what it was, and he said it was something she could read later. And but that he just cautioned her to read it on her own, and that it was something that she might not want to read in the presence of her husband. So then he says, okay, he says, now you're telling me that she got my sheet of paper. What happened? So I said, Abigore, what happened after you got the piece of paper? He wants to know. And she goes, well, I read it just the way he said, nowhere near my partner. And I hid it. I kept that page. She says, for years. And she said, and over those years, Karen, I tried several times to do one or two of the things on the page, or I would get through the list. But I was doing them haphazardly. I wasn't following them in an order. I would read them and I would just grab one and I'd think, oh, I'll just try that one. She said, it took me over a decade to realize that the way Lister wrote the list was in an order. And when I say that, Lister looks destroyed. And I said, are you okay? And he goes, I never thought that I had to write down that the list was in an order. He said, I just wrote it in the order, thinking that she would read it and do it in the order. And Abigore says, oh, please tell him this is not his fault. So I said, Lister, she's trying to say to you, that's not your fault, that you couldn't foresee that you were trying to do it. He says, I was so careful about how I wrote that list. I went to my friends so many times to make sure it was in an order. He says, I stressed over it so much. And he says, now to understand that I put it in an order, but that she didn't read it in an order. And that's what got her stuck. He says, it's not sitting with me. He says, I feel like I'm the one that got her stuck then. And she comes through to say, oh, no, honey. She says, it worked out fine. She says, I needed to go through those things somehow in a random order to kind of figure out, oh, I did it, but it didn't work. And then I realized, oh, I did need to do these things in a kind of order for it to work for me to be able to leave, and for me to leave and never to go back again. And he went, okay, I don't understand that, but okay. So then she just simply says to him how important it was that she had that list. Because of the way she was raised as a child, she was never raised to take care of herself or to think in order or to create processes because she was just told to do what she was supposed to do by her parents and then by her husband, and that they didn't give her processes, basically, I'll say on purpose, so that she really didn't know how to think for herself and create healthy processes. And he goes, oh. So I explained this to Lister, and he goes, okay. And she goes, so the list, even if he had said, this is a list, do these things in order, she doesn't feel that way back years before when she first got it, that she ever would have been able to follow it and do it. And or to believe in the process. So she said it took her time in her own growth and in her own lessons in life to understand how to think for herself and how to create process. Because she had children with him, she had to learn that she didn't know what processes were, because as the children would come home with homework or assignments in steps, she would just do things randomly. And the children had to say, Mom, you've missed these steps. This is how you solve this problem. And then she realized, because the children were going through these things in school, that she really wasn't following anything in her anxiety and in her stress, that she wasn't following 1, 2, 3, even something as simple as the children's homework. And so once she realized, oh my God, I'm not doing that, she started to realize, what is wrong with me that I don't see life this way, and that I get anxiety following a process, but I also have anxiety creating a process and being in one. And she said that it took her time in doing homework assignments or just doing things with her children to realize how bad it was for herself in her own thinking and in her own execution and in her own ability to even problem solve or to see options. And then she found this paper that Lister gave her, remembered this, went back and read it from the very beginning, and realized he gave her a process. And then started in the process and stuck to every single thing that was on that page. And when I said that to Lister, he goes, oh my God, please, please, please go on. Please tell me more, finish this. And I said, Abigore, what's he waiting for? And she goes, I left. And I said, oh my God, he doesn't even know that you left that marriage? So you guys haven't spoken. And she goes, that's right. He doesn't know. He's here to find out if I ever left. So Kelly, let me clarify something here. It doesn't make sense to me about him knowing her, not knowing her. And he explains to me that he knew her before the marriage. He knew her in her marriage, off and on. And then they split ways. He can't stick around to see what's going on in her life. Then she leaves her husband, and then she gets diagnosed and she's dying. He finds out through mutual friends that she's just dying. And by the time he reconnects with her at the very end in life, he just finds out at the very end when she's lost consciousness, and he just goes to see her as she's dying.
Which is why he doesn't know the
what
marriage
happened.
ended.
So he doesn't know. I know a lot of this, it gets confusing. And I understand you can be confused, and so can people listening to the story, where things don't always add up. And even in the sessions, when they're over, I like to ask clients for clarification because they don't make sense to me about timelines or about, well, how'd you know this, but you didn't know that, right? Because we're just giving pieces or just answering their questions in a session. So Abigore explains that she did end up leaving her partner, her husband, but he never knew any of that. So Abigore says to me, I want to tell him that I know that he came to see me when I was dying, and that I wasn't able to speak to him. I wasn't conscious anymore. I was medicated by the time he came to see me, but I want him to know that I know he was there. And I said, did he come into the room? Did he touch you? Did you want to say anything about, did he talk to you? Were there any words? Is there anything else, Abigore? And she goes, oh, he just came in and he just told me that he loved me and that he was sorry. And I said, sorry for what? And she says, oh, he just said sorry. But I think what he was meaning was sorry, like that we hadn't stayed friends, and sorry that he hadn't been there through those other parts of my life. She says to Lister that she certainly understood more about her choice and who her husband was and the things that she went through in her marriage before she passed away. But by no means did she understand all of it. Mm-hmm. And that it required her death to fully show up today in the session to be able to explain everything to him. And he sat and said to me, this is so important to me. He says, to know both. He says, I needed to hear that she understood some of it before. And he says, and I'm so relieved and happy to know she gets all of it now. Does she understand how much I loved her? Does she understand how much I tried? Does she understand how hard it was for me to walk away from her and not to keep coming back and keep seeing what she was going through, that I just couldn't? And he said, I finally had to walk away for me, but at the cost that I couldn't be there for her. And I asked her that, and she said, yes, that's what I'm trying to say. And this is why I'm trying to explain it in all of these ways and say these things. I'm trying to show him that. So when I said that back to Lister, he sat there, he just cried. Mm-hmm. He said, I've waited like my whole life to hear this. And I would say that at the time of the session with Lister, he was probably, I'd say maybe in his late 60s. He says, it's been a long time. He says, because like I've known this person my whole life, and I felt like she was my sister. I felt like I lost my sister. And he said, it feels today like I've got a sister back. Mm-hmm. And he says, and today it's like I feel like I've got her back, but in the best way possible. And he says, and that makes me happy and sad because she's dead. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, Lister, I said, this is something I really understand personally, and something that I also really understand for each client. That this is what we are seeking when we are looking to speak to a medium, that we want all of this so much. I said, you're very brave. I said, because we want it, and some people will listen to this today and hear it as a podcast and want it themselves and still not book an appointment with anybody because they're so afraid that they may see the medium and still not get all of this. That they may get the brown hair, blue eyes, she drove a red car, like more of that kind of information, and feel that they are supposed to be content with it, or that they got their needs met when they didn't.
Fair.
Yeah.
Well, certainly happy for him.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you for listening to Coffee with the Sarlos. If you enjoyed the show today, please be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform and leave a review. New shows will air every other Saturday.